Good evening, everybody, and welcome to an on-time departure. My name is Mick McCarthy, and I am the Executive Director of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here at Santa Clara, and welcome to the opening of the 2014 Bannan Institute on Ignatian Leadership. Both in Silicon Valley and beyond, the Ignatian Center aspires to provide leadership for the integration of faith, justice, and the intellectual life. And then within the Ignatian Center, the Bannan Institutes are year-long thematic programs that address matters of significance within the Jesuit Catholic intellectual tradition, foster an ethic of dialogue among persons of diverse religious and philosophical commitments, and facilitate opportunities for interdisciplinary exchange across the university and the broader community. This year, we will be exploring the theme of leadership, taking our inspiration from the spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Within this framework, Ignatian leadership, as we're calling it, is a practice that seeks to effect personal and communal transformation. And throughout the year, there will be a range of events on the theme. During the fall quarter, we will be focusing on the practice of justice within Ignatian leadership, exploring how commitments to solidarity and social justice ground the work of Jesuit higher education. In the winter, we will be turning our attention to the role of faith, highlighting examples of men and women with Ignatian vocations, including my own brother Jesuit, Pope Francis. And then in the spring, we will conclude by considering the role of the intellectual life, examining the means with which Jesuit Catholic universities seek to form whole persons, engaged citizens, and accountable leaders. While we encourage you throughout the year, tonight we're especially delighted to be partnering with the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. The Commonwealth Club is proud to podcast and broadcast a number of our programs on KQED on Fridays at 8 p.m. and KLIV AM on Thursdays at 7 p.m. And for this reason, especially, it's going to be recorded and over podcasts and the radio, we kindly ask you to turn off your cell phones and anything else that would make noise. During our program, there will be time after the speaker offers his lecture for questions, and so we encourage you to write them down on question cards as members of our staff and volunteers will collect them throughout the program. So we're thrilled to begin this year's Institutes with one of the most distinctive, challenging, and provocative voices in the United States. To introduce tonight's speaker, please welcome Professor Juliana Chang of Santa Clara's English Department. Dr. Chang.
At this time, I will pause for a brief moment as we begin recording this evening's program. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program, hosted by the Bannan Institute of Santa Clara University's Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education and the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley. My name is Professor Juliana Chang. It is a great honor to introduce the scholar, theologian, activist, one of the most important public intellectuals of our time, as he himself puts it, a bluesman in the life of the mind, a man Newsweek calls a prophet with attitude, Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a professor of philosophy and Christian practice at Union Theological Seminary and professor emeritus at Princeton University. A prolific writer, he is best known for his classics Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His most recent publication, Black Prophetic Fire, highlights 6 revolutionary African-American leaders and examines the impact they had on their own eras and across the decades. Professor West appears frequently on The Bill Maher Show, Colbert Report, CNN, and C-SPAN, as well as his dear brother Tavis Smiley's PBS TV show. He has made 3 spoken word albums, collaborating with Prince, Jill Scott, Andre 3000, Talib Kweli, KRS-One, and the late Gerald Levert. His spoken word interludes were featured most recently on Bootsy Collins' The Funk Capital of the World. Dr. West has made a profound impact in the political, intellectual, and spiritual lives of so many of us. In 1992, as a doctoral student, I read the proceedings from a conference on Black popular culture, held in part at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I came across the following passage in which Dr. West differentiates between pleasure and joy. Quote, "Pleasure, under commodified conditions, tends to be inward, but joy tries to cut across that. Joy tries to get at those non-market values: love, care, kindness, service, solidarity, the struggle for justice, values that provide the possibility of bringing people together." This passage has stayed with me for 22 years and has influenced my own research and writing on feelings of both joy and trauma in relation to race, gender, and culture. Where pleasure can be contained, joy bursts at the seams. A feeling of exuberance, joy exhilarates. Joy is more difficult, more demanding, more traumatic than pleasure. It's risky. It's scary. Joy demands courage. In giving ourselves to joy's limitlessness, we lose our own boundaries. We become something no longer ourselves, something greater. I thank Dr. West for giving us courage in reaching for this something greater. Dr. West's talk tonight is entitled Black Prophetic Fire, Intersections of Leadership, Faith, and Social Justice. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cornel West.
Thank you so very much. What a blessing, what a privilege, what an honor to be here. Santa Clara University, what a special place. What a consecrated place it is. I want to thank my dear sister and distinguished Professor Julie Chang for those kind and generous words. And similarly so for my new brother, the Executive Director, Michael McCarthy. Give both of them a hand. Absolutely. And I thank the Commonwealth Club for facilitating my coming as well. I salute each and every one of you, and I hope I say something that thoroughly unsettles you. Oh, yes, I've come to unhouse you if I can. But I want to begin by saluting the captain of the ship, my dear brother, President Michael Eng. President Michael Eng, where is he? I don't know where he is, but give him a hand, give him a hand. Yeah, indeed, indeed, indeed. And I want to acknowledge my dear sisters, Margaret Everett and Robin Fulton as well, 2 magnificent sisters who's done such a wonderful job. Give them a hand as well. And there's so many others. I was blessed to have such a powerful and poignant and insightful discussion with the brilliant students, at least a slice of the brilliant students. I think they represented the rest of you all very well in the dialogue we had for almost an hour and a half or so. It was just magnificent to come on this campus and see the cross, how rare it is, to see that symbol of unarmed truth and unconditional love. What Jesuit tradition that says the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, and that has the audacity to believe that justice is what love looks like in public. Yes, indeed, 1851. Those brothers years ago had the vision in this space to say we ought to engage in a grand exploration of education. And thank God they didn't say schooling. There's a qualitative difference between education and schooling. That they understood, as my own tradition always reminds me, that the unexamined life is not worth living, at line 38a of Plato's Apology. But also line 24a, where Socrates says, the cause of my unpopularity was parrhesia, frank speech, plain speech, unintimidated speech, speech that is unafraid but still mindful of its own fallibility. So my reflections on Black Prophetic Fire, and I must say I pay tribute to this institution because the book actually is not to appear on the stands until October 7th, and somehow Santa Clara University got early copies. I think it was the workers behind the scene and professors like Professor Brett Johnson Solomon, high quality that she is. Give her a hand. She facilitated the dialogue with her beloved daughter. She facilitated the dialogue. But somehow they had access to this Black prophetic, probably Jeremy Berry, my brother, who's facilitated my coming for 10 years now. But I want to begin with W.E.B. Du Bois. He was 89 years old. He emerges from a courtroom. He was in handcuffs just a few years before, cast as working for a foreign agent, even though he was part of a peace information center trying to wipe out nuclear weapons around the world. But this was the moment of the Cold War in the history of this country, this fragile democratic experiment, this empire. He's 89 years old, and what does he decide to do? Embark on the writing of 3 novels. Yes. In that first novel, The Ordeal of Man's Art, turn to page 275. He says, I've been wrestling with 4 questions all of my life. First question, how does integrity face oppression? Integrity, that's a word we don't hear too often these days in the market-driven culture obsessed with cupidity, and venality, and vapidity. Integrity, that's an old school word. The Jesuits understand what I'm talking about. Ignatius, St. Francis, Santa Clara. Cutting against the grain. Socrates exemplifies it. Second query briefly. What does honesty do in the face of deception? In a culture of vast mendacity, often intertwined with criminality, easily hidden and concealed in the name of respectability. Deodorized, sanitized, sterilized discourses that don't allow us to keep track of the funk that's operating on the ground in the lives of precious everyday people, in the language of that genius from Vallejo, Sly Stone. Everyday people, their decency. Third question is, what does decency do in the face of insult? How does one preserve one's decency given the bombardment of insult, attack, assault? Sometimes maim and murder follows therefrom. And the last question, what does virtue do in the face of brute force? I want those 4 queries to sit in the backdrop of these reflections on Black Prophetic Fire as we begin on this Socratic note. What does it really mean to examine ourselves in light of a deep commitment to education, not just market-driven schooling? Well, the Greek actually says the unexamined life is not a life of the human, I know Professor McCarthy teaches Latin, and he'd be the first to tell us humando. Latin means burying. That's where our word humanity comes from. That's where humility. We are those particular organisms transacting with our environment who often, like elephants, bury their dead. Meaning also that we're on the way to the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. We're candidates of the very thing that we enact. That gives it a certain sense of urgency and emergency, even as we're playful in the short time between mama's womb or tomb. But then, in terms of our present moment, you can't talk about fire, let alone prophetic fire, and just unless you're willing to wrestle with the most terrifying question: what does it mean to be human? What does it really mean to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces? Ooh, that's terrifying. People ask me why I spend so much time around funk masters like Bootsy Collins and George Clinton. They remind us we all, no matter what color, no matter what sexual orientation, no matter what gender, no matter what culture, we emerge from our mama's womb. That love push that got us out. And of course, today, we're born, we're old enough to die. So the question becomes, in any serious wrestling with education, I use the Greek word paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, that formation of attention. How do we attempt to attend to the things that matter? Echoes of Plato's Republic, the turning of the soul that must take place in any serious education. And of course, these days we're bombarded by mass weapons of distraction. Consumption, narcissistic indulgence, obsession with money, 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 as Wu-Tang Clan reminds us. Cream, cash rules everything around me, but it doesn't have to rule me, around me. Society of big money, big banks, big corporations, obsessed with short-term gain, obsessed with profit. Very little concern with human needs, very little concern with the least of these, especially the children, 22% living in poverty, almost 40% children of color living in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. If that's not a moral disgrace, I don't know what is. But the question is an existential one before you get to the politics. What kind of human being are you going to choose to be? What kind of virtues, what kind of visions will be enacted and embodied in your short time from mama's womb to tomb? And it puts at the very center of any talk about leadership, any talk about prophetic fire, you talk about faith and justice, wrestling with forms of death. One of the problems in the history of American civilization, at our worst, we have been a death-ducking, death-denying, death-dodging empire and civilization. That's why it's so easy to talk about America and hardly say a word about the indigenous peoples who were here before we got here. And all of the forms of attack and assault, precondition for American democracy. Why in our U.S. Constitution no reference to social death, the American social death, which was U.S. slavery? 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies enslaved human beings. No reference to the institution, just a gesture about the slave trade being terminated in 1808. And yet their labor was a very precondition of the democracy because their wealth was the foundation, a major part of the foundation for the possibility of the USA. That's a death-dodging constitution. Wonderful words, I'm not denying. but a pro-slavery document in practice between 1787 and in the 1860s. We don't like to be reminded. Why? Because you got to come to terms with death. I hate to pick on Disneyland and Disney World, but that's so quintessentially American. And they often brag about nobody dying on their premises. Just fun all the time. Everybody just feeling so good all the time. Now, don't get me wrong, I felt good when I went too. I'm American too. I'm just a self-criticism. Where there is no death, there is no life. Because paideia itself is predicated on a meditation and a wrestling with forms of death. I tell the students who come in my classes now for almost 40 years, the minute you come in and sit down with a smile, you have consented to learn how to die in order to learn how to live. Montaigne, the great Catholic philosopher, said, to philosophize is to learn how to die. And even Seneca, and we don't expect too much profundity from the Romans. He's so busy running an empire. Seneca says, she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. To come to Santa Clara University in the rich tradition of our Jesuit brothers is to say, yes, I'm willing to learn how to die, because anytime I examine assumption or presupposition, anytime I examine a prejudice or prejudgment that I have and I'm willing to give it up, that's a form of death. And there is no maturation, there's no growth, there's no development without death. So when the blessed students graduate, when is it? In May or June here? In June, you got late graduation. Long time to learn how to die. But when you march in June, if you hadn't experienced that kind of death in order to be reborn, to grow, to mature, to develop, you're wasting somebody's money. And that engagement with death as a critical process also has its structural challenges, and that's why black prophetic fire is crucial. Because it's impossible in America, 400 years, to be a black person and not be on intimate forms with some form of structural death. I already talked about social death, slavery, 244 years, no social status, just a commodity to be bought and sold. Dishonored, devalued, dead at 26, replaced with slave importation. 244 years. Here comes Jim Crow, 90 years of civic death, part of the social body, no civil rights that allow you to be part of the public life. American lynching, terrorism, every 2.5 days, some black woman, child, a man swinging from some tree. That strange fruit that the great Billie Holiday sang about, and the Jewish brother Maripol wrote the lyrics. And then there's this psychic death. Taught to hate yourself and told you have the wrong hips and lips and noses and hair texture and skin color. And then the spiritual death, feeling as if there is no hope, that your history is a curse, your hope is a joke. Your sense of freedom is a pipe dream. Still at work in the new Jim Crow today. Still at work in the hood with disgraceful school systems and indecent housing and massive unemployment, and still not full access to health care. That's part of paideia. That's what the Jesuit brothers understood. If you cannot connect the social and the spiritual, the economic and the existential, the personal and the political, and still link it to something bigger than you. Where's that cross, that unarmed truth, that unconditional love none of us ever fully grasp or fully approximate in our living, but we fail and bounce back like that lapsed Christian Samuel Beckett. Fail again, try again, fail better. Fail again, try again, fail better. And you see, from my tradition, the black prophetic tradition, that Socratic questioning, keeping track of the assumptions, not name-calling and finger-pointing, but beginning with what is inside of one's own self. See, when I engage in critiques of white supremacy, I'm not just talking about vanilla brothers and sisters. I'm talking about the white supremacy inside of me. It's impossible to be an American and not be shaped by white supremacy. White supremacy operates in the souls of black people in a very deep way. White brothers and sisters don't have to be around for white supremacy to operate. They've already been shaped and molded by the institutions of the culture. Of course, that's true for sisters, the male supremacy inside of women. Brothers don't have to always be around to see male supremacy. Just look inside of the souls of women. They've been shaped by patriarchal institutions. Same is true for homophobia. Same is true for class privilege. And it's certainly true for imperial privilege. This notion that somehow a baby in Santa Clara has more value and significance than a precious baby in Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia or Ethiopia, or Guatemala, it's only concerned about the nationalist tribe, Jesuit education. Each and every one of us made in the image and likeness of a God who is no respect of nation, color. Ooh, that sounds revolutionary. It is. It is. And the best of the black prophetic tradition has followed Socrates. That's what Frederick Douglass did. That's what W.E.B. Du Bois did. That's what Ella Baker, that's what Ida B. Wells-Barnett, we know Brother Martin and Malcolm did. They engaged in frank speech, plain speech, and it scared the mainstream, and it scared many black people too. And they paid a major price, just like Socrates. But unlike our dear pagan Socrates, as exemplary as he was, he never sheds a tear. We were talking about this with the students today. Thomas More in the Tower of London, about to be put to death, holding on to his Catholicism. Vicious treatment by the Protestants. And he writes a dialogue on tribulation. Why is it that Socrates never cries and why Jesus never laughs? And it pushed his mind, heart, and soul to the edge of life's abyss. And you see, the black prophetic tradition follows Socratic questioning at a serious level, beginning on the chocolate side of town, no doubt, but it spills over into the larger question of what it means to be human across the board. But for Socrates not to shed a tear means that's a keep sweat moment. Something just ain't right. There's a limitation here. See, Jesuit education connects the legacy of Athens with the legacy of those who begin with cries and tears, the legacy of Jerusalem. The cries of an oppressed people in Hebrew scripture. A conception of humanity that says to be human is to spread loving kindness, hesed to the stranger. 35 references in Hebrew scripture. Neighbor, Leviticus 19:18. Widow, weak, vulnerable, poor, oppressed. It was a moral revolution in the history of the species that the fundamental core of being human had to do with the quality of your service couched in terms of loving kindness to those, in the language of Malcolm X, those who are catching hell. On the language of Frantz Fanon, the wretched of the earth. We know our Jewish brothers and sisters celebrating a holy day. God bless them. It's a grand contribution. Africa had great civilization, so did Asia. So did indigenous peoples. And they had deep insights, had concern with the poor, but to create a whole tradition of a conversation that's multi-layered of the prophetic that begins with tears. We just heard John Coltrane. I know it may have sounded as if it was just elevator music. No, we let Kenny G take care of that. I'm talking about John Coltrane. Coltrane's love supreme and giant steps and impressions and expressions and ascension is about what? It's about bringing together deep Socratic questioning of what it means to be human, intellectual, intense, honest, candid, but it also is connected to the spirituality of loving, of having compassion, of pushing oneself to the end of one's own powers and recognizing you have to take a leap and take a risk and be vulnerable. Socrates is never vulnerable. He's obsessed with self-mastery. Amos is vulnerable, and so is Jeremiah. Even Nahum was, yes, indeed. And Jesus weeps. What radical act. That God incarnate himself weeps. How come? Because he loves so. And he doesn't just love wisdom in the abstract. He loves concrete, fleshified persons. And at the very center of his conception is what the great W.E.B Auden had in mind when he said, how do we muster the courage to love our crooked neighbor with our crooked hearts? To be able to keep track of the wounds and choose to be a wounded healer rather than wounded hurter. Oh, that's so much of the tradition of the best of those infused with black prophetic fire. That's what Emmett Till's mother enacted when she had to speak with her baby right in front of her with the casket open after his body had been fetched from the Tallahatchie River in Gut Bucket, Jim Crow, Mississippi. Brought it back to the west side at Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ. Miss Till, what you got to say? Well, I like Fannie Lou Hamer, I question America. Very Socratic. But oh yes, like the prophets in Hebrew scripture, like that Palestinian Jew named Jesus that means so much to the Jesuit educators. Mrs. Till looked at her baby, tears flowing, mind enacting serious critique, and looked in the cameras from all around the world and said, I do not have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. What goes into the making of human beings who make those kinds of choices? And she's not isolated by herself. There's a whole tradition of those with black prophetic fire who don't lead by calling themselves leaders, but who lead by raising questions and loving others in such a way that they exemplify what people want in their leaders. And that's a qualitative difference. And it's not a question of ideology and politics. It's one of the reasons why when I was coming along in Sacramento, California, my own blessed Sacramento, and Brother Craig Berry and the others from SACTO, you go in the Black Panther office and see Martin Luther King pictures on the wall. Oh, you don't agree with Martin Luther King Jr., you know that. He's nonviolent. You all believe in freedom by any means. What's his picture on the wall for? because he loved us so. Christians got Malcolm X on the wall. You know that he didn't have a thick Christology. He was a revolutionary Muslim brother. What's he on the wall for? He loved us so. He told the truth from the depths of his soul. We're going to keep him on the wall, even given our disagreements, because at the deepest level, the lower frequencies in which you have to define your humanity, you're looking for those that Du Bois talked about in terms of integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue, even given the fact that you may overlap here and not overlap there. And that cuts across race, doesn't it? Because there's old vanilla John Brown. Love black people more than most black people love themselves. Willing to die. There's Ann Braden, there's Miles Horton, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. We can go on and on and on. Adrian Rich, Muriel Rukeyser, those from the other side of town that say, given our conception of deep questioning and commitment to compassion, we not only embrace, we are in solidarity, and we're willing to take a risk, even if the Thanksgiving dinner is a little challenging with relatives. Oh yes, just got to cut against the grain. Cut against the grain. But that's in part what leadership in its deepest sense is. You see, it's a willingness to think critically in a Socratic mode, to speak candidly with courage and humility, and they do go hand in hand, to act honorably, and to be willing to risk one's popularity for integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue, which is the risk of being misunderstood. W.E.B. Du Bois thoroughly misunderstood. Wouldn't have put him in handcuffs. Frederick Douglass, bounty on his head. Not fully understood. Martin Luther King Jr., when he died, 72% of white Americans disagreed radically with him. 55% of black people disapproved of him. Brother West, how can that be the case? Everybody loved Martin. Once the worms got his body, everybody loved Martin. He talking about bringing poor people together. He talking about a critique of the American empire in Vietnam. He was willing to go with Malcolm X to the United Nations to bring a critique to bear an indictment for the United States for the violation of the rights of black people. That is not the kind of activity that leads toward popularity. But he gets so Santa Clausified, turn him into Santa Claus, and old man with a smile on his face and toys in his bag, make everybody feel good. Can't wait till January to feel as if you can engage in your cultural diversity moment. We all love Martin. Yes, we do. Oh, let's just stay extra time to celebrate him. Oh, when he was alive. And my God, Malcolm X. Whew. Malcolm was probably the most misunderstood black man in the history of the country. How come? Because all people remember Malcolm was so mad. Well, yes, we do have to distinguish between righteous indignation and raw rage. There is a difference between fighting for justice and just expressing revenge. There's no doubt about that. And the early Malcolm tended at times to overlap. But because in America, most of the time we look at folk with black prophetic fire through the lens of white fears and anxieties and interests and preoccupations. So the question is, what is he saying about me? What's he going to do to me? And there's nothing wrong with thinking about that at a particular moment, but the whole world doesn't evolve around that question. It's one of the reasons why people are so crazy about Nelson Mandela. We love Nelson Mandela because he forgave white people. You think he went to jail for 27 years because he wanted to forgive white people? He went to jail because he loved black people. He was fighting for black freedom. He just happened to be grounded in a Christian tradition that led him to love white folk enough to forgive them, but that was not at the center of his witness. And in the end, you're just scared that you thinking he gonna do to you what you did to him. Oh, yes, broaden the discourse out. Malcolm had a black love. And it was partly because he was so unloved. He was a gangster for so long as Malcolm Little until Elijah loved him into his sense of possibility. And when he became Malcolm X, he started with a deep love affair of just the chocolate side of town. He said, white folk are devils. He's wrong. White folk often act devilish. He's right. 1961, absolutely right. 2014, we'll have a dialogue. But if you lose sight of the deep love inside of him, then all of a sudden he becomes outside of the Socratic tradition. No, he had some deep questions for America. He had some connections, what goes on in the Middle East. He had connections with Palestinian brothers and sisters and what's happening in the ghettos. He had connections with what was going on in Africa, in Belgian Congo with Lumumba, in Ghana and so forth. He had some questions what was going on in Latin America. I saw the magnificent salute to our precious Jesuit brothers and the magnificent mother and daughter right in front of the mission. Thank God you got that witness there. Why? Committed to Socratic questioning, witness rooted in deep love and compassion, paying the ultimate price. But there's a link between the American imperial activity in El Salvador and the companies that are there and the other companies just obsessed with making money and losing sight of the precious humanity of God's people, which is all of us made in the image and likeness, but especially built on Hebrew scripture. The least of these that Jesus echoes in that 25th chapter of Matthew. And what a challenge it is. Now, it's very, very difficult these days to engage in this kind of dialogue. And this is one of the reasons why I took a risk to drop this text and put it out there at this moment. Because in the age of Obama, there's such pervasive confusion and capitulation and wondering what to think. 2008, we had such a magnificent moment, so many tears, genuine tears, sense of possibility. You see, we had a number of people talking about race doesn't matter, post-racial America. Thank God racism has come to a close. The White House, built by black slaves, now inhabited by a brilliant, charismatic black brother with brilliant, charismatic black wife and two precious black children. Who would have ever thought America had the capacity? I know I didn't. I really didn't. When I saw him in 2007, I said, I'm going to support you. I'm going to push you as far as I can. But God created a world in which all things are possible, but I got a sense of reality here. I'm just going to push it. Lo and behold, it followed through. No doubt. But how then do you talk about black prophetic fire? Does he become identical with the black prophetic tradition? Does he displace the black prophetic tradition? So that the legacies of Du Bois and the legacies of Ida B. Wells and King and others are subsumed by his presidency that brings in the Wall Street representatives of Geithner and Summers, that generate more drones dropping bombs on innocent people, that expand the national surveillance state to keep track of not just every phone call, but even to assassinate 4 Americans with no due process or judicial review whatsoever. Is there a focus on the new Jim Crow in terms of what's going on in the prison-industrial complex? Or is it a matter of being subsumed by a neoliberal regime which always proceeds in a threefold fashion: financialize, privatize, and militarize? Financialize, privatize, militarize. You got a problem? Just bring in big money. Bring in the money from the big money people. Privatize it, because that's where all the technological innovation is. And of course, make sure that you have military capacity in order to keep order. Look at Ferguson, and what do you see? The results of financializing, wealth hemorrhaged at the top. 1% of the population owned 42% of the wealth. In the last 4 years, 1% of the population got all of the income growth, every penny of it. Well, a black president, love the brother. Black prophetic fire, tell the truth. In light of what? Those catching hell. The children, the prisoners, the workers, the marginalized, the widows, the elderly. Brother West, would have been worse with the Republicans. Absolutely. That's true. Prophetic fire is not involved in political calculation as to what some of the opportunistic options might be at a particular moment. It's about telling the truth, exposing lies, and bearing witness. It's a very different kind of discourse. If you don't have anybody out there trying to be honest enough and respect the people enough to telling the truth, which begins with keeping track of the suffering and the lens through which those suffering folks have to wrestle every day, then you end up with a more narrow, emaciated, truncated political discourse. Far-right Republicans, neoliberal centrist Democrats, very few progressives, and the left nearly invisible in the corporate media. And what happens to your Jesuit education, where you were told, we are going to begin with the cross. We're beginning with cries, questions, victims of empire, as Jesus, victim of the Roman Empire, and yet the love keeps flowing. And that love is a matter of keeping track of the humanity, not just the wounds and the bruises, but the wounds and bruises, but also the creative responses, the cultural responses. And you'll see there's moments in the text where I talk about the just how more and more empty our culture is in terms of the music. You know, I ask young folk, do you have music that can sustain your soul? If all the musicians, especially black musicians, before 2001 were wiped out. See, Sister Rihanna ain't gonna do it. Beyonce ain't gonna do it either. Jay-Z ain't gonna do it. Kanye ain't gonna do it. They towering figures, they not gonna do it. If you can't have the traditions of Mahalia and Aretha, Donny Hathaway and Luther Vandross, James Brown and all of the others that feed into the sustaining of a soul, not just the stimulating of a body. You see, that care and nurture. They just don't somehow try to convince you to consume and put the tension on them, rather than them giving a gift to you to allow you to be more critical and more loving. I could just say, Curtis Mayfield, and sit down. Just say Curtis Mayfield, just sit down. In terms of his corpus. In terms of all the marketeers telling him, stay away from Martin, stay away from Malcolm. No, how can I be an artist in a Socratic prophetic tradition if I'm not connected with the people and willing to take a risk? They won't play my music on the radio. That's all right. I won't win a Grammy. That's all right. Give it to Milli Vanilli. They got some. So what? But the Jesuit education says, oh, you follow Socratic and the prophetic, and if you're willing to bear witness, that's not your reward. You're not talking about cupidity and venality. You're talking about integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue. And that, for me, is our challenge these days. I don't believe black people have a monopoly on it, but my claim is this. When the black prophetic tradition is weak and feeble, you can be assured the progressive tradition in America is weak and feeble. It has repercussions and effects far beyond the black side of town. You see, it has effects on women, on workers, on gay brothers and lesbian sisters, has effects across the board, has effects on the new immigrants from India and Ethiopia. They come into America and they say, oh, this is a strange place. You all have a very parochial political discourse. And you're very navel-gazing in your preoccupations. Oh, they read Du Bois. Ah, he's a globalist. They see Martin talking about the World House. He's a globalist. You see, Ida B. Wells giving her lectures in Britain, not only critical of slavery, but critical of patriarchy in the 1890s, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the others. I started on a Socratic note. I'm going to end on a blue note. Because I started with the notion of forms of death, and we could call it catastrophe. Ecological catastrophe, impending, closer every day. Nuclear catastrophe, still tens of thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at each other at this very moment. America got 17,500. Russia's got thousands. Pakistan's got them. India's got them. Israel's got them. They won't say, but they do. The spiritual catastrophe, empty souls. Moral catastrophe, indifference, callousness toward those who suffer. That's where the blues comes in, what you heard in Coltrane's music. B.B. King say the blues ain't nothing but a catastrophe lyrically expressed. Echoing Ralph Waldo Ellison. He says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's catastrophic. That's the blues. Black folk on intimate terms with catastrophe. But what do you get in B.B.? Standing tall, smile on his face, dignity, style, a little help from Lucille, falling back on the tradition of geniuses in gut bucket Jim Crow Delta, Mississippi, that give him a fire that says, I got to tell the truth, and if I don't do it, the rocks are gonna shout. They're gonna cry out. And if I can lift my voice, maybe some other voices can be lifted. If I can lift my voice, maybe I can touch some souls to speak their truth in the midst of the different kinds of catastrophes coming our way, so that we don't result in paralysis and feel so debilitated that we sell our souls for a mess of pottage. Or we give up, become so well-adjusted to injustice that we think that black prophetic fire is something in a museum rather than something on the street, in the classroom, in the mosque, or synagogue, and temple. That's the challenge of black prophetic fire. That's the relation of black prophetic fire to the rich tradition of Jesuit education. And of course, I stand here open to be challenged, to be questioned. I hope you also say a prayer to be loved, but tough love as we struggle together. Thank you all so very much. I saw you standing there. I saw you standing there. Now, both of you. Just a little bit.
That's great.
I said, well, I got to wrap this up.
So,
But what did we go 45 minutes or something?
Fantastic.
No, that's
45
good.
minutes, yeah.
That's all right, yeah.
It's great.
And then we'll...
So you
do
want
we
to sit
sit?
down? Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and sit down?
Do we want to go home?